I'm going to read a bit from an internet page that I found about a man called Fritz Duquesne, or as the English would probably say, Fritz Duquesne. He was a Boer avenger, German spy, and Munchausen fantasist. And the London Daily Mail of May 27, 1919 says this of him. Colonel Fritz Duquesne, a fugitive from justice, is wanted by His Majesty's Government for trial on the following charges: murder on the high seas, the sinking and burning of British ships, the burning of military stores, warehouses, coaling stations, conspiracy, and the falsification of Admiralty documents. He carried on hostile operations against the British government in various parts of the world under the following names: Fred, Fredericks, Captain Claude Stoughton, Colonel Beeson von Richthofen, Piet Nicode, etc. His correct and full name is Fritz Joubert Marquis Duquesne. Prior to the war, he was known as Captain Fritz Duquesne, a big game hunter, author, explorer, and lecturer. The New York Evening Post of August 21, 1920 says this of him: "He is one of the most desperate and daring criminals we have ever had here. His adventures read like a romance." And that was said by Abram I. Rourke, New York City Assistant District Attorney. The FBI said of him in their document of March 12, 1985, about the Duquesne spy ring, it says, on the 2nd of January 1942, 33 members of a Nazi spy ring headed by Frederick Joubert Duquesne were sentenced to serve a total of over 300 years in prison. They were brought to justice after a lengthy espionage investigation by the FBI. And here you'll see in the video, I'm going to put a photo of him, and that's him in around 1900, when he was in the Boer War, or the so-called Boer War, because the British started it, not us. So Leslie Evans says this of him: Frederick, or Fritz, as he was known, Joubert Duquesne, 1877 to 1956, was a South African Boer who led an astonishing life on both sides of the law. Officer in the Boer Army in the war with England, many times an escaped prisoner, pimp, newspaper reporter, foreign correspondent, novelist, spy, and saboteur in South America, where he blew up British ships during World War I, advisor on game hunting to Theodore Roosevelt, publicist for Joseph Kennedy's movie business. He feigned paralysis for 5 months to avoid deportation to England, where he faced execution for the deaths of British seamen. And finally, he was the best known member of the largest Nazi spy ring broken up by the FBI during World War II. Beyond his real exploits, Duquesne lived under some 30 aliases. He invented and reinvented his past at will, claiming to have been the greatest swordsman in Europe, attaching his ancestry to this or that aristocratic clan that momentarily appealed to him, granting himself military titles and medals, and producing endless accounts of battles, some of which he actually took part in. His most famous claim was to have guided the German submarine to sink the HMS Hampshire in 1916, at the height of World War I, which killed Field Marshal Herbert Kitchener. Britain's Secretary of State for War and the head of Britain's armed forces. There are two biographies, one which is adulatory and one which is disparaging. Clement Wood's 1932, The Man Who Killed Kitchener, called Duquesne one of the bravest and noblest men who ever lived. Art Ronnie's 1995, Counterfeit Hero, dismisses Duquesne for 4 decades of spying, fraudulent activities, lunacy and masquerading. These wildly differing appraisals tell us at the outset that there is something more here than a cold-blooded German agent, a more interesting outsider. The two biographies are very different in style as well as content. Ronnie's is a conventional account, written more than 60 years after Wood's. It carefully documents its sources with many footnotes and about bibliography. Wood's book is long out of print and generally sells for $200 or better. I managed to get a copy, says the author, in poor condition for $80. Wood met his subject only 3 times, not aware of who he was really until afterwards. The first was in 1917, while Duquesne was living covertly in the United States after having escaped from a British prisoner of war camp in Bermuda. Always one for hiding in plain sight, Duquesne was disguised as a mythical Captain Claude Stoughton of the West Australia Light Horse, a non-existent regiment, and he was on a national speaking tour across the United States promoting the American war effort. Wood was merely a member of the audience. Wood spent an evening with Duquesne a decade later as part of a small group in Wood's hotel room in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Duquesne was introduced as Major Reginald Anson of the British Army. Wood mentions seeing Anson once more in Martinique in 1931, but gives no details. Wood passes over his sources evasively. In Port-au-Prince, following the evening, where Reginald Anson enraptured the company with his war stories, Wood is approached by an elderly agent of a steamship line. This unnamed man reveals that Major Anson is secretly Fritz Duquesne, and turns over to Wood a large stack of documents and photographs that a friend is said to have collected with the intention of writing a book. The documents are never described further. The book Wood writes about Duquesne is a fictionalized biography. He cites no sources, provides no index, and fills out what he knows about Duquesne with a steady stream of invented description and dialogue. How the birds were singing on a particular day, what people ate for dinner, which way Fritz looked while fording a river, chit-chat among soldiers, descriptions of scenes that only come from his own imagination. Though there was a real Fritz Duquesne, and many of the incidents in The Man Who Killed Kitchener can be authenticated from other sources, the book itself I found to be most useful for seeing where Fritz, or perhaps Clement Wood, had stretched a tooth. A word on Wood and why he would be particularly sympathetic to Fritz Duquesne. The British fought 2 wars predominantly against the Dutch Boers in South Africa. The second, 1899 to 1902, was the most brutal. Discovery of gold and diamonds had led to a large influx of British citizens into South Africa, and a decision was made in London to forcibly dissolve the 2 small Boer states, the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State, and to incorporate their territory into a larger British colony. The Boers put up a fierce resistance, including a prolonged guerrilla war. The British, led by Kitchener, who became commander of the British forces in South Africa in November 1900, initiated a scorched earth policy, burning farms and villages and driving Boer families into concentration camps. The first large-scale use of this device. Some 22,000 children, at least, and a smaller number of adults were starved to death in the camps. While the majority in Britain supported the war, the left wing largely opposed it, on humanitarian grounds, particularly the Liberal Party and the Irish. Neither side paid much attention to the rights of Southern Africa's black majority. Clement Wood was born in Alabama in 1888. He moved to Greenwich Village, became a socialist, served as secretary to Upton Sinclair, and was supporter of Sacco and Vanzetti and Tom Mooney. As a militant opponent of British imperialism, it is not surprising that he would view Fritz Duquesne as a kind of modern-day Scarlet Pimpernel. That framing of the Boer spy's career would shift when the Germany he worked for against the hated English came under the control of Hitler's Nazi Party. Fritz in South Africa. Frédéric Hubert Duquesne was of French Huguenot descent. Catholic France's brutal wars of religion against the Protestant Huguenots had ended with the Edict of Nantes of 1598, granting legal rights to her Protestant subjects. The edict was repealed by Louis XIV in 1685, and the Huguenots were driven out of the country. Thousands set sail for South Africa in 1687, including many relatives of the French naval commander Abraham Marquis de Quesnay. One of their descendants, Frédéric Le Huguenot Hubert Duquesne, he later changed his spelling to Duquesne in America in 1912, was born on December 21, 1877 in East London on the South African southeast coast. His father was Abraham Duquesne, his mother Mina Hubert. Fritz always claimed that his mother was the sister of the famous Piet Hubert, the Boer commander-in-chief in the Second Boer War. Art Ronnie says that he can find no evidence of this connection. Fritz soon had a younger brother and sister, Elspeth and Pedro. When the children were still young, the family bought a farm in Nylstroom. Today it's called Modimolle, something or other, in the country's far north. His father was a hunter and trader and often away, leaving the farm in the charge of Mina and Fritz's old blind granduncle Jan Duquesne. At the age of 12, Fritz killed his first man. The main house had a room used as a trading post. One day, while his father was away, his mother began bartering with a Zulu customer, who attacked her when she would not meet his asking price for goods he wanted to sell. Fritz grabbed the man's assegai spear and stabbed him in the stomach. That same year, a war party from a Bantu-speaking tribe attacked the area. Hearing of the impending assault, 6 families set off in ox-drawn wagons for the nearest settlement at Sand River. Caught on the road, they drew the wagons into a square and fought a long gun battle with the raiders, even coming to hand-to-hand fighting. 12-year-old Fritz proved to be one of the best shots among them. When he turned 13, Fritz was sent to England for his education, where he spent the next 4 years. Clement Wood has it that after graduating, Fritz did a year at Oxford, then entered the prestigious École Militaire in Brussels, where he had a short stay at the French military academy Saint-Cyr. Wood says trained Fritz trained under the prominent fencing master Julian Merckx and became the champion swordsman of Europe, and that he had fought 8 duels in which he killed his opponent 3 times. Art Ronnie says there is no record of Duquesne's European Championship, but that he was an excellent fencer and took part in many matches at the New York Adventurers Club. Ronnie cites in contrast a 1913 letter from Fritz to Stephen Allen Reynolds, in which he says that after his 4 years in England, he was sent to Europe to study engineering, but on the ship met an embezzler named Christian de Vries, and the two decided to take a trip around the world. Abraham Duquesne caught up with his son in Singapore 6 months later and gave him a good whipping. Ronnie suggests that Fritz spent the next 3 years bumming around Europe, returning home periodically to go home on hunting parties. At the age of 21, in the summer of 1899, his father called him back to South Africa as the Second Boer War was on the verge of breaking out. When he did return, he spoke with an upper-class English accent. Fritz was commissioned as a lieutenant and assigned to Commander Piet Joubert's staff. He received a bullet through the shoulder in the Battle of Lombard's Kop in 1899, where the Boers defeated the forces of Major General John French, who would later be Commander-in-Chief of Britain's forces in France during World War I. Fritz was promoted to Captain of Artillery. The first Duquesne legend arose in this period. By May 1900, the British were winning the positional warfare and taking the Boer capitals. The guerrilla war was just beginning. President Kruger, before going into exile, is supposed to have tried to ship 1 million or more pounds of gold and state documents to safety in Europe. Dispatching 30 ox-drawn carts headed for Lourenço Marques seaport in Mozambique, which is today called Maputo. En route, Fritz is said to have met the caravan with credentials, putting himself in charge. The 4 white soldiers assigned to the convoy tried to assassinate him and steal the gold. He killed them all. Then all of his native crew, after hiding the gold in caves near the Drakensberg mountains, were killed by tribesmen. The gold was never recovered. The story persists, though no one can say whether it is true or not. For a while, Fritz led a small commando unit to blow up British trains and sniped at British soldiers. He was captured and escaped twice, once grabbing a guard's pistol and killing him, the second time with his hands tied, leaping off a bridge into a river. He became known as the Black Panther of the Veldt. He fled to Swaziland, where he was captured. He was shipped to a prison in Lisbon the British were using for prisoners of war. That's in Portugal. There he seduced the jailer's daughter and was soon on his way to Brussels, where he met the representatives of the now-defunct Transvaal Republic. He was sent to England, where he pretended to be a Boer defector. He volunteered for the British Army, was given the rank of lieutenant, and sent back to South Africa. There he was assigned to a light cavalry unit. He soon deserted and became a courier between the small isolated Boer commando units. He ran his own commando group, particularly harassing Kitchener Scouts, led by Chief of Scouts, the American Frederick Russell Burnham. Burnham in his autobiography wrote, "There were only 2 men on the veldt I feared, and one was Duquesne." He added, "Much has been written about Duquesne, most of it rubbish. Yet his real accomplishments were so terrible and amazing that they make the yellow journal thrillers about him seem as mild as radio bedtime stories. Each man was assigned by his superiors specifically to kill or capture the other. While serving as a Boer courier, Fritz was able to make his way to his family farm in Nalstrom. There he found a scene of utter desolation. His house was burned to the ground. An elderly black servant told him that a party of British soldiers had gang-raped and then shot his sister Elspeth. They hung blind old Uncle Jan, and they raped his mother, who was then taken to a concentration camp. He swore a lifelong oath to wage war against the English and against General Kitchener, who he held personally responsible for the destruction of his family. Fritz put his British uniform back on and went to the nearest camp at Germiston, east of Johannesburg. He found her there, starving, infected with syphilis, with a syphilic infant in her arms. He swore he would make the English pay. He never saw her again. Leaving the camp, he passed 2 captains. He shot them both dead. Next he went to Cape Town, arriving in October 1901. He was accepted as a British officer. He recruited 20 Boer sympathisers and made plans to plant bombs at power plants, munition dumps, rail yards and bridges. He was personally to blow up the reservoir above the town, releasing a huge flood. Typically, the night set for the detonations, Fritz put on his best dress uniform and attended a party for the governor of Cape Colony. One of his band turned traitor, and Fritz and the 18 others were arrested. At their trial, all were sentenced to be shot at dawn. That night, Fritz was offered his life if he would reveal the Boer codes. He did so, claiming afterward that his version was deliberately inaccurate. The other 18 were executed on schedule. In the Cape Castle prison, he spent months working with only a spoon to dig away at the mortar building, holding the large stones of the wall in place. On the night he was to escape, he kicked out several loose stones and began to crawl through the hole when a cave-in pinned him to the ground. This made the jailers decide to ship him to a new British penal colony in Bermuda. On shipboard, while at a stopover in the Azores Islands, some of the prisoners were allowed on deck. Duquesne tried to escape, grabbing an inattentive guard's rifle and beating him to death with it. He threw the body overboard, but the other guards arrived, and the chance to get ashore evaporated. As no observer would testify, and there was some chance the missing guard had jumped ship, no charges were filed. In Bermuda, the British had recently established prison colonies on a number of small islands off the coast of the main islands. The incorrigibles were sent to Tucker Island, where they had been handcuffed for 14 hours a day. There, Fritz, while on a prison work detail, met Alice Wortley, daughter of an American businessman from Akron, Ohio, who was serving as Bermuda's Director of Agriculture. They were drawn to each other and by a strange route met again later in the United States and married. Always ready to invent self-glorifying details, Duquesne told everyone, including Clement Wood, that Alice was from a long line of English aristocrats and that her father was the Governor-General of Bermuda. Wood's book also contains one of Duquesne's favourite fictions, that Alice helped him escape. According to Ronnie, a guard promised Duquesne and several others aid in this escaping. He unlocked their shackles, then shot the first man to go over the fence. It seems there was a reward for killing escapees. The survivors were transferred to Bird's Island in St. George's Harbour. By this time, the war in South Africa was over, and the imprisoned Boers were offered repatriation, but on the condition that they sign an oath of allegiance to England. The irreconcilables refused and remained in prison. On June 25, 1902, on a rainy night, Fritz slipped past the wire fence and swam a mile and a half in shark-infested waters to the mainland coast. He made it to the home of a Boer sympathiser who gave him clothes and some money and sent him by boat to Hamilton, Bermuda's diminutive capital, where he disappeared into the slum by the docks. There he teamed up with a black prostitute named Vera. She was paid 6 shillings a trick, and Fritz pocketed 3 of that for bringing her sailors. The arrangement lasted barely a week when he discovered that one of the clients he had picked up was a steward on the luxury yacht Margaret, sailing in the morning for Baltimore. He got the man drunk, took his clothes, and staggered aboard the ship pretending to be drunk. His ruse was discovered the next morning, but by then they were at sea. The captain swore he would turn Fritz over to immigration when they docked, so Fritz went over the side in Chesapeake Bay. He walked and rode freight cars to Paterson, New Jersey, where he had been told to contact a Boer sympathiser, Alison Wortley, having been informed of his destination by his benefactor in Bermuda. She visited him there. 12 years of civilian life in America. And here's a photo of Fritz when he was a journalist in 1913. The Boer network sent Fritz to Manhattan, where as an undocumented alien, he worked first as a subway conductor, then as a bill collector for the New York Herald. He regaled the staff with his adventure stories and was asked to write a few for the paper. This led in 1904 to a job as a newspaper reporter for the New York Sun. 2 years later, he was made Sunday editor. Between 1904 and 1909, he worked for 3 major New York newspapers and may have served as a foreign correspondent. He was written up in Men of America, 1908, where he claimed that after arriving in New York, he had been a war correspondent in Russia, Macedonia and Morocco, and served in Paris on the staff of Le Petit Bleu. Elsewhere, he also claimed to have toured the Congo Free State on behalf of the King of Belgium and gone to Australia, where he said he took part in a 1904 to 1906 expedition headed by Sir Arthur Jones. And finally, he was said to have been in charge of building a string of theatres in the British West Indies for Alice Wortley's father, S.S. Wortley. Duquesne certainly was a prominent reporter in New York, but Arthuroni says he can find no evidence that any of those foreign adventures actually happened. Fritz did write 3 novels, one published in Le Petit Bleu and the other 2 in South Africa. In those years, Duquesne was best known for his many articles on big game hunting in Africa. He was invited to the White House in January 1909 for a 2-hour session with Theodore Roosevelt, who was preparing, as his second term ended, to embark on a 2-year expedition to go hunting in Africa. Fritz was one of several advisors, but became well known on the lecture circuit after his presidential audience. His next adventure was to team up with Frederick Russell Burnham, General Kitchen's former chief of scouts. The two had been pledged to assassinate each other during the Boer War, but now they formed a company together to try to get Congress to authorize importing hippopotamuses into Louisiana swamp for their meat, and camels in the far west as draft animals. The country was in the throes of a severe meat shortage, and the scheme was endorsed by Theodore Roosevelt and the New York Times. Duquesne, on March 24, 1910, testified before the House of Representatives Committee on Agriculture in support of Representative Robert F. Broussard's Louisiana Bill, H.R. 23261, which called for allocating $250,000 to investigate importing large African animals as a potential food source. A short Kindle book has just been published on this project called American Hippopotamuses by John Mooallem. The Amazon description lauds it as a historical saga too preposterous to be fiction. The bill was never brought to the House floor. Here's a picture of Fritz's wife, Alice Wortley, in 1913. In June 1910, Fritz Duquesne married Alice Wortley. They would remain together for 9 years, during much of which Fritz was elsewhere. In 1912, he drove a van throughout New York State, campaigning for Theodore Roosevelt, running for president on the Bull Moose ticket. He published nominally true stories in the Adventure magazine, along with such authors as Sinclair Lewis, Talbot Mundy, H. Ridger Haggard, John Buchan, and Raphael Sabatini. He was a founding member of the Adventurers Club, an association of about 40 members limited to adventurers, explorers, soldiers, travellers, filibusters, soldiers of fortune, and other kindred spirits. In the summer of 1913, Roosevelt set out on a second expedition, this time to South America. Fritz cooked up some business deals to finance a trip to follow, raising $5,000 from Goodyear Rubber to search for rubber plants and getting a contract with a small film company to make a documentary on the Roosevelt expedition. Neither of these came to anything. He and Alice left for South America in December 1913, taking $80,000 worth of film stock with them. Just before sailing, Fritz became a naturalized American citizen. They were in Manaus, the capital of Brazil, Amazonia state, when World War I broke out. Fritz sent Alice home and applied at the German consulate to become a spy. As a special incentive, his hated adversary Kitchener had become Britain's Secretary of State for War. Paid modestly by the Germans, Fritz Duquesne virtually disappeared, while around the ports of northern South America there appeared an actor called Frederick Fredericks, a middle-aged Dutch botanist named George Fordham, and an old South African Boer named Piet Nakaud, which is the phonetic Duquesne spelled backwards. These fellows drifted from Brazil to Dutch Guyana, Venezuela, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, everywhere with large crates of mineral samples or orchid bulbs sent on outgoing British ships. Fritz later claimed that 22 of them sank, which Clement Wood repeated. Art Ronnie was more sceptical, but certainly some ships sank. Wood says one of these crates weighed 80 kilos or 176 pounds. During this period, Piet Nakaud was a popular figure in British circles in Brazil, making anti-German speeches and giving dramatic readings of literary works. But that's really Duquesne.